It's a great pleasure, both personally as someone who's known Deirdre since the 90s and found we've got lots and lots of common interests, from cricket to theology. So it's a great pleasure as a friend to introduce Deirdre. But also as Vice President of the Economic Society in New South Wales. The Economic Society is sponsoring Deirdre's visit to Australia as part of the Eminent Speakers series. Our first eminent speaker, Deirdre's the third. The first was Joe Stiglitz, and Deirdre's rather different customer in lots of ways to Joe Stiglitz. Deirdre, as you see in your program, is Professor of many things at the University of Illinois in Chicago, of economics, of history, of literature, of communication, and I discovered this morning also of philosophy and classics. So now Deirdre is a person of many, many interests. Deirdre made her name as a quantitative economic historian, working particularly on Britain and British decline. The beginning of Deirdre's decline or enlightenment, depending on which view of the world you take, was a sabbatical at ANU in the early 80s, where she started reading Richard Rorty, started reading some philosophy, which is a dangerous thing for a quantitative economic historian to do. So Deirdre then wrote an article called The Rhetoric of Economics, which is a minor classic of the discipline, pulling apart some of the classic papers of the discipline and showing that the image economists have of themselves, or that present to the world, of being men in white coats just doing the numbers. We don't have any agenda here, was completely false. A wonderful read, The Rhetoric of Economics. But that was the beginning of Deirdre's decline or enlightenment. Deirdre, soon after that, changed gender, previously Donald to Deirdre, as she now is. And then a couple of years later, even more scandalously, converted to Christianity, or at least of the liberal Anglican, liberal Episcopalian variety. So Deirdre has led a very, very interesting life, and her more recent publications range from a wonderful book on writing economics, a book that many economists could do well to read. It's not on the bookstall, probably should have been. And she's written on significance testing, the pseudo-scientific character of a lot of contemporary economic writing. Her most recent project, which you can buy outside and signed, I believe, later too, is her multi-volume theological defence of capitalism. The first volume, The Bourgeois Virtues, the second volume, Bourgeois Dignity, are available outside. And the third volume will be coming sometime in the next couple of years. And there are bits and pieces of it on her website. Introductions at events like this are best short. So I'll just close with one reflection on Deirdre's work. There are many, many people who, to a sympathetic audience, can rally the crowd, can talk about the wonders of markets or freedom or something like that. But Deirdre is a person who is able to engage with a very, very broad cross-section of people. The Bourgeois Virtues was dedicated to her socialist religious friends. This morning, I was with Deirdre at Alpha Crucis College, a private college associated with the Pentecostal churches that is moving towards university status. And amidst a group of theologians, many of whom or most of whom were very much on the left, Deirdre offered a spirited defence of freedom and of markets. So she's a person, as you'll see in a few minutes, who is a wonderful advocate for the sorts of things that the CIS promotes debate about, and not just to the converted, but to a very broad section of people. So without any more from me, I look forward to what Deirdre has to say to us tonight. So Deirdre, welcome.
I just had, could we turn on the microphone? I just had 2 hip joints replaced. I can highly recommend the operation for anyone here who is hesitant about it. This one was replaced 4 months ago, and this one about 2 months ago. But I still have my cane. It's a magic cane. It folds up like this. So it goes in my purse. I think I'm going to keep it even after I'm perfectly well, because then I can get, at airports, I can get sympathy. Oh, I need a wheelchair. I'm here to speak. Oh, but by the way, I have a speech defect among my other faults. I stutter sometimes, but I'm sure with this friendly crowd, it won't be a problem. Let's start with a fact. The fact is that a life in business, a life in a commercial society, is not the worst life ethically that one can imagine. Now, most people in this room find that very easy to believe, but you know that a lot of people outside this room think it's wrong. That is, they think that if you're in business, you're a grasping, greedy Simon Legree beating on the workers, and they don't understand that your purpose in business is altruistic. More altruistic indeed, say, than the average government bureaucrat. Your business is to please, enlighten, enrich, feed your customers. So I always shock my socialist friends by saying that capitalism, I don't like the word for reasons I'll make clear in a moment, but capitalism is an altruistic way of organizing a society. It's not built, people often say, the heart of capitalism is competition, and that's so terribly nasty. But of course, point one, the competition is to please the customer, please feed, enlighten the customer. That doesn't sound so bad. But then, as practically everyone in this room who's had any practical experience in business knows, business is very largely about cooperation. It's very largely about finding ways for win-win opportunities. By the way, that phrase was invented by a woman in the 1920s. Win-win. Why am I not surprised that win-win was invented by a woman? So that indeed is the first, that's the point of this book. I have just given you the executive summary of a 500-page book. That doesn't mean you shouldn't buy it when you go out. It makes a very good Christmas gift. Your mother or your sister or brother will be delighted to have this for a birthday present. So buy them in bulk. There you are. The Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce. Now, as I said before, a lot of people outside this room find the idea of bourgeois virtues laughable. The idea that middle-class people in business could be virtuous. They can be rich, that's okay. Okay, they got rich, but they're not virtuous. But I argue in detail in this book that, for example, John D. Rockefeller was a good man. He was a Baptist, I'll forgive him for that. But he persistently gave away from a young man when he was a young man in business in Cleveland, he started to give away well over 10% of his income every year. So that's the first fact, that, so to speak, an ethical fact, that a life in business is not the worst life, ethically speaking. As Paul mentioned, I'm an Episcopalian. We had to call ourselves Episcopalians, not Anglicans, after we revolted from England. We couldn't go on calling ourselves Anglican. But I'm an Episcopalian, and I've seen worse behavior in the church than in most businesses. I have a friend who's a lawyer who deals with companies and sometimes with churches. And he says church people figure that they're on God's side so they can do anything. So that's the first fact. Fact number 2, the great enrichment. The great enrichment has happened in the last couple of centuries. I look around this room. I don't see any descendants of the crowned heads of Europe or Asia or Africa. I don't see any Habsburg chins. I'm looking very carefully. No, I don't think so. Will the person here who's the descendant of a king or queen please raise their hand? I don't think so. We're all descended from very poor people. In the Australian case, from convicts. And the average income in terms of Sydney prices in the world, the average income and expenditure per day in 1800 was about $3 a day. Imagine getting along in Sydney right now on $3 a day, sleeping rough. It's $3 a day. Large parts of the world's population still live on $3 a day or less. And that's not just marketed income, that's all sources of things to eat and wear and so forth. Now, Australian national income per head is on the order of $120 a day. And that's conservatively measured. And indeed in the world as a whole, including very poor countries like Bangladesh and Chad and so forth, it's now $33 a day. From $3 to, see, this is good, you know, this thing is a pointer. $3 a day to $33 a day for the whole world. And for the countries that have adopted the bourgeois virtues, that have agreed to what I call the bourgeois deal. You let me as a bourgeois make money, engage in creative destruction, and in the long run, I'll make you all rich. That's the bourgeois deal. Those societies that have accepted that ideology, that idea, have had an increase not of a factor of 10 between 3 and 33, but a factor of 30 and more. Now, I think there's a connection between those two facts, and that's my point this evening, that the ethics of business, the ethics of a life in a commercial society, which many of the artists and intellectuals since the 1840s have thought is just a contradiction in terms, madness, is connected to the great enrichment of the modern world. The great enrichment was utterly unprecedented. It had never happened before. The glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome, the Song dynasty in medieval China, none of them had anything close to a factor of 10 even, and certainly a factor of 30 increase in their incomes and their consumption. It's unique to the modern world. Indeed, it starts in northwestern Europe. It starts in Holland in the 17th century, spreads to England and the English North American colonies, and then to northern France and Belgium, and on and on. And it's what's made the modern world. This kind of event would be impossible for your ancestors or mine. Mine were Irish and Norwegian. My great-great-great-grandmothers worked in the kitchen or the garden or minding children all day. My great-great-great-great-grandfathers worked in the field or sometimes in the factory. And that was their life. And mine is a life of reading books, giving speeches in Australia that strangely follow the course of the Ashes competition around Australia. I was in Brisbane. I was going to see the last day of the test, but you may have noticed there wasn't a last day. I was quite annoyed as I'm an English supporter, I apologize. And I'm on to Adelaide next week. All right, so why did it happen? As I told you, I think it happened because of an ethical change that made a life in business respectable and honorable and free. But there are two mistaken theories about how we got here. How these peasants, former peasants, my friend here was saying he just bought a farm, so he wants to go back to being a peasant. He's now enslaved to 80 acres, 3 hours north of Sydney. Why did it happen? How did it happen? Why did this unique event happen? There are two mistaken theories. One from the left is exploitation. You exploit the working class, or you acquire an overseas empire, you rip off some people, and that provides, as the Marxists say, an original accumulation of capital from which comes the modern world. Now, I was once a Marxist. I've been everything. I've been a Marxist, I've been an agnostic, I've been a man, I've been a Democrat, I haven't ever been a Republican, but maybe I'll soon get there. But that doesn't work at all. It doesn't work for the simple reason that exploiting people has been pretty much what the elite and ruling class has been doing since the invention of agriculture. That's what elites do, or at least traditional elites. That's not what the present elite does. The present elite runs profitable firms for the ultimate good of all consumers. But the earlier elites had a much simpler business plan. Your ancestors work, and I come and I take it from you. Brave Sir Botany, I come with a sword and a horse. So sorry, this my income now. And exploitation of workers is, in this old-fashioned way, is commonplace. Empires are commonplace. The Assyrians come and conquer Israel, ancient Israel, and well, that's too bad for ancient Israel. Now they have to pay taxes and so on to the Assyrians in the north. So it can't be that exploitation empire is what explains the modern world, because there had always been such things and we didn't get a modern world. The other explanation, sort of from the right in politics, is saving and investment. And there will be lots of you here who think that's what caused the modern world. These excellent, virtuous capitalists saved a lot and made factories and provided jobs for people, and that's why we got the modern world. That's got the same problem as the Marxist argument does, which is that investment, saving, commerce profit-making markets are very ancient. It's simply not true that ancient people didn't save or accumulate. You've seen pictures of the Acheulean hand axe, which was used for 1.3 million years by our ancestors, not Homo sapiens, but the older ones. Homo habilis, tool-making man. And his main tool was this rock that he had made sharp on one edge. And that was his accumulation. And there are vast accumulations of them. People would work away and accumulate. Accumulation is the way of living for humans. It's not new. It's not something that started happening in the 18th century. We've been saving and investing anciently. In fact, in Europe, where the yield per unit of seed is very low in the Middle Ages, 3, 4. So you cast on the ground the seed that could feed your children. Imagine that. You cast it on the ground and hope that next year you'll get a good crop. And that's saving on a massive scale, as economists define it, abstaining from consumption. So those two don't work. And that's the burden of this other excellent book for Chinese New Year, Hanukkah, your unbirthday. This is it. To put the point another way, the Great Enrichment was the most extraordinary secular event since the invention of agriculture, since the domestication of plants and animals in 9 separate and independent parts of the world, starting about 10,000 years ago. It's just a remarkable event. Remarkable events are not explained by ordinary economics. The first person who gave this lecture, Israel Kirzner, a friend of mine, has a much better way of looking at this whole matter. He says that discovery, which is one of his favorite words, in a sense always has to be, well, it has to be unusual or it wouldn't be discovery, would it? I mean, it sounds like a kind of a silly point, but the guy deserves the Nobel Prize. He hasn't got it, but he deserves the Nobel Prize for this insight. Innovation, which is what made the modern world, not investment. The innovation of electric lights and this beautiful carpet and the inexpensive linen and all the amazing ideas of institutions and things and making things, products and how to make them that market-tested innovation and supply has made for us in the last 2 centuries. It's discovery that made it all. It's invention, and so it's got to be non-routine. And the trouble with most economics, not Israel's economics, but most of it, or mine, but most of it, is that economics is about the routine. Now, I'm in favor of routines. I want to know about balance sheets, and I want to know about marginal products, and that's very nice, and I teach it to students and so on. But routine can't explain extraordinary events, or else the extraordinary events would already have happened. Do you see what I mean? If it's just a matter of investment and routine investment, and then you get the modern world, we would have had the modern world, I don't know, before the last ice age. But we didn't. We only had it once. All right, so what then is the correct theory? I've told you what the wrong theories are, these conventional economic explanations. The correct theory is ideas, innovation, that itself came from liberty and dignity for ordinary people. Now what happens is that hierarchy, inherited position, having nothing to do with your contribution to consumers' welfare or your inventive ability. You're the Duke or the Duchess because your parents were dukes or duchesses, and that's it. That society, which we've escaped, was opposed to innovation. The very word in English, you can see this in the Oxford English Dictionary, the very word innovation doesn't become a good word until late in the 19th century. In the early 19th century and before, innovation is bad. Innovation is heresy. Innovation is disturbing the existing rewards of the society. Innovation is going to upset the Duke, and we mustn't have that. And so in most societies, before ours, before the last couple of hundred years, innovation was restricted, monopolized, killed. One of my favorite places in the world is Venice. And it's got a most interesting history. But Venice, the whole purpose of Venetian policy was monopoly. Its foreign policy against Genoa, its struggles with the Byzantine and then the Ottoman Empire were all about getting monopoly privileges for Venetian merchants. And then internally, it was guild run. And the guilds, in their bourgeois way, created and then strictly enforced monopolies. It's no surprise that patents and copyrights were invented by Venetians. Those two institutions, which I've been growing increasingly suspicious of, are attempts by the middle class to create inherited wealth, create a machine for sending you rents forever. And that's characteristic of Venice. In Venice, if you were a glassblower who had some secret of the trade, and you went to France in order to spread the secret around, the Venetian state would send agents to Paris, seize you, bundle you off, bring you back to Venice, and jail you for life. So that had to break down. The traditional aristocratic hierarchy, the bourgeois versions of it, such as Venice, had to break down, to fragment, as they did in northwestern Europe, starting, as I said, in Holland in the 17th century. Why did they break down? They broke down because of accidents of European history compared with the great empires of China, the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, and Japan. Europe had a Reformation. I'm not making Max Weber's argument about the Protestant ethic, which I think is incorrect, but I am making the point that the radical Reformation, the Anabaptists and the Quakers and so forth, were breaking up religious hierarchy. And the same is true of the revolts, the successful revolts, Holland against Spain, the English Civil War, the trial by jury, so to speak, of an anointed king and his execution on January 30th, 1649. These events shocked Europe and were prevented in the other great advanced economies of that time. The most advanced economy technologically in 1600 or 1700 was China, not Europe. And why didn't the Industrial Revolution and the great enrichment happen in China because of a unified Chinese polity that stopped innovation. Well, how about the future? Many of you are practical people. Well, what's the future going to bring? We can see the future in China and India. I know that the Australian economy is closely attached to economic growth in China, which is one reason that Australia was not greatly damaged by the problems in the United States and elsewhere. These two economies are growing at 7 to 10% a year. Why are they growing it so fast? Why are they on the business end of the hockey stick zooming up at this rate? The answer, I think, is that both of them had an ideological change. Both of them had the same change that happened in Holland and then in England and elsewhere long ago, 3 centuries ago. And the change is to accept the bourgeois deal, to accept, instead of shooting entrepreneurs, encourage them. I have a student named Deja, an Indian, from South Asia, an Indian, who showed that the Bollywood plots change. In the 1950s and 60s, the heroes are the police and government bureaucrats, and the villains are in business. By the 1970s and 80s, after trying that for a while, the Indian popular movies reversed, and the heroes became entrepreneurs. That was before Singh, that was before 1991. In a slightly different way, an ideological change of the sort that made the modern world in northwestern Europe also happened in China, starting in 1978, thereby a more evolutionary process. The whole world is going to become rich. That's what's going to happen in the next 50 years. The whole world is going to come to have an Australian standard of living. There are no racial obstacles to this. Sub-Saharan Africans have more genetic variability than characterizes most of the people in this room, from Australian Aborigines to Norwegians. And it's when Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, develops, becomes rich, as it will by accepting the bourgeois deal and zooming up the business end of the ice hockey stick, it will become the great intellectual and artistic center of the world. So my case here this evening is that the modern world was made and will be made by ideas, by ideologies, by faiths, you might say. It's not made by material causes in the first instance. It's not made by saving or exploitation. It's made by how we talk about each other. It's not a spirit of capitalism that grows within a single person's breast. It's how we evaluate your and your and your activities. It's sociological, it's political, not psychological or conventionally economic. I'll end by recommending not only that you buy my books and put in your early offers for volume 3 before it sells out. It hasn't been printed, but you must get it early. By saying that this is an example of what this argument I'm making is an example of what you might call humanomics. Economics with the humans left in. I have a friend, his name is escaping me, my good friend, what's his name, said to me, well, I was urging the importance of ideas on him, and he said, oh no, you need a killer app, as we say. Well, this is the killer app. If the history of the West and the world since 1600 is not a pretty good killer app, I don't know what is. If I'm correct about this, ideas, language, ideology, discovery, all the things that economics, conventional economics, non-Israel Kirzner economics leaves off, need to come back into the story. So thank you very much.
But just one little note that I should make, should let you know, because of quite a coincidence. As Deirdre and as Paul also mentioned earlier, one of the reasons she's here, apart from giving lots of talks to various economic groups and to us and so on, is to see the cricket. As we got an email yesterday from the producer of the program, one of the radio programs that she did an interview. She said, "Oh my God, she's a cricket nut." And so I was able to say, well, okay. Michael mentioned that the first lecture was held in 1984, and Deirdre talked about Israel Kirzner, who was the professor of economics at New York University, gave the lecture, and what a great school of economics he comes from. And he gave the first lecture in Adelaide in 1984, but in the audience was Don Bradman. So, and so she's, sorry? Well, oh, he's around somewhere. So now is the time is for questions. So has anybody got a question? No? Oh, okay, Barry, up the back. If you can go to the microphone, please.
Barry Maley. Professor McCloskey, you told us, I think, that bourgeois virtue and integrity is a vital underpinning of a market society.
Yeah.
But that virtue is really a moral achievement.
It is.
And I'd like to have your views on how you think that was achieved. How did it come about?
Well,
how was it achieved? And
yeah.
the second part is it always a necessary condition of enduring capitalist success?
Well, I think it is an enduring condition of sustainable, to use a fashionable word, success of a market society, that it be viewed as ethical. It's not so much that the individual business people in Holland or England became ethical and before they weren't, or something like that. And it's not even necessary that there be an absence of corruption. I mean, after all, I come from Chicago. And 4 of our last 7 governors in Illinois have gone to jail. And Chicago was the fastest growing city in the world in the late 19th century, and everything was for sale. So it's not personal ethics that's at stake here. It's the conception by the rest of society of business people. After 1848, the artists and intellectuals started to sneer at business people and think of them as unethical. There was this brief period before 1848 in which most of the artists and intellectuals were actually favorable towards the business world. And that's what we need to do in order to get a society of market-tested innovation and supply to work well. People have to be in on the deal. They have to agree with it. There has to be support for it. So that's where the ethics comes from.
Okay, but Peter.
Professor McCloskey, Peter Kersey, Centre for Independent Studies. I'm an Anglican minister, but very sympathetic to the Episcopalian Church. I was married, my wife and I were married by an Episcopalian bishop, so all is good. Can I ask you about, I was very taken by your remarks about the importance of discovery and innovation and the experience of the extraordinary.
Yes.
And the idea that this openness to ideas might have been interpreted in another age as heresy.
Yeah.
If you hold to that, my question is this. What value might the idea of theological orthodoxy mean to you as an Episcopalian Christian?
Well, we Anglicans are broad church. I don't need to explain to you. And we view ourselves as standing between Catholicism and Puritanism. We're a church of the community. That's always been a big emphasis in Anglicanism. Now, the orthodoxy is routine. Let's start with that. Or I don't have to start, I'm not going to go on and on about it. Ritual is routine. And one of the great attractions, in my mind, of the Anglican Church, or Catholicism light, as we sometimes call it, the frozen chosen, is that every Sunday you say the same words in the Mass. So there's a place for routine. There's a place for economics. There's a place for conventional economics. But real innovation, as you said, comes from heresy. Real creativity in the arts or in literature or in the economy comes, let's take Starbucks. Starbucks is a crazy idea. In the midst of falling coffee consumption per capita in the United States, this guy thought, well, coffee sells for 50 cents a cup. Suppose I charge $2.50 a cup. That seems like a good business plan. And he made just not a fortune. He changed their coffee drinking habits. So it's out of heresy that comes growth. I think it's true individually too.
Simon.
I just want to read a quote here, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this as a Christian libertarian, as you describe yourself. Overnight, Pope Francis said, "As long as the problems of the poor are not radically resolved by rejecting the autonomy of markets and financial speculation, and by attacking the structural causes of inequality, no solution will be found for the world's problems or any problems." My question is this. Why is it you think that compassionate people who obviously want to improve the lives of the poor, seem to believe that innovation, markets, free will is not the solution to bringing people out of poverty? Why do they reject your thesis?
They haven't read my books. And they haven't read Israel Kirzner's books, and they haven't read any of the lecturers who have made this lecture. Here's the problem. I mean, maybe I said, I forget whether I said it or not, I give a considerable portion of my income to charity every year. And that's good for my soul. It's a good thing for me to do it. But I don't imagine that I'm solving the problem of poverty that way. And a lot of my contribution goes to poor people in various ways. My church, with some others, supports, well, it doesn't matter what the details are. But the fact is, the quantitative fact, I'm a numbers person, I'm an economist. I didn't have the personality to become an accountant, so I became an economist instead. I once tried that joke on a group about the size of academic accountants, and no one laughed. Okay, so the numbers are this: poor people are gigantically bettered by just what you said, by innovation, by allowing capitalism, or as I call it, innovism, which I think is a better, more accurate word, to work. That's what's helped us to become educated and full of that excellent lamb we had. Whereas redistribution, which is what the Pope is recommending, doesn't do much. If you took all the income of the rich people, we took the income of the people in this room and took it from you and handed it to poor people, it would help the poor people a little bit, maybe 20%. Some of the poor people would be 20% better off, not 2,900% better off, which is what growth in the last 2 centuries has done for places like Australia. 2,900% versus 20%. You don't have to be an accountant to see that the 2,900% is better. I wish I could speak to the Pope. First, I would ask him to resign and close down his office, but I don't think he will. We tried that in Anglicanism, it didn't work.
Alan? Yeah.
Alan Anderson, you concluded your address with a very optimistic picture of the world in which everyone had become rich in 50 years, and sub-Saharan Africa was the intellectual centre of the world. And my question is, wouldn't you accept the proposition that it may be the case that some cultures, not genetics obviously, but some cultures, place greater obstacles in the way of adopting the set of ideas that you believe lead to prosperity, and therefore it may be longer than 50 years before, and it may indeed be generations, before we can shift those cultural norms so that they can accept those ideas?
I don't think it'll take many generations, but I accept that there are political situations and social formations and cultural habits that might, for a while, prevent an economy from sharing in this amazing engine of creativity. But look at the historical evidence in this. Well, let me start by just saying India and China. When I was young, of course still very young, but when I was even younger than I am now, we were all told in economics that China was hopeless. They're all Confucians over there, so that's why it's hopeless. Or they're all communists, that's why it's hopeless. In the case of India, well, they're all Hindus. What do you expect from Hindus? They aren't going to be entrepreneurial or allow the commerce to flourish. And then look what happened in both of these countries. Take the case of Chinese. Take the Chinese case. Inside China, in the Qing dynasty and the Ming, innovation was stifled. But the overseas Chinese in Indonesia for 400 years have done very well indeed, thank you very much. The overseas Chinese in Australia, for that matter, have done very well from the very beginning. So it's not Chineseness that's the problem. It's the temporary dominance of a particular elite. And when that elite breaks down, which is my underlying story, when the elites break down in a way here's the word, it's fashionable on the left, but I don't mind. I was a Marxist once. It empowers people. My story is a matter of empowerment. And I think that can happen very fast.
Okay, Jeff.
Jeff Hogman. There seems to be enormous and increasing faith in government as a means of solving problems.
Alas.
Do you fear that will erode the institutional framework that's been responsible that's given us our success?
Well, I got mixed feelings about it. I mean, I know that the Orthodox opinion is that I should view every government program as the road to serfdom. And I understand the point, and I do worry about it. But on the other hand, I've lived in social democracies. 3 years in Holland, 3 years in Britain, which is kind of social democracy, at least more than the United States. And now I am a professor in Sweden as well. And these are not serf societies. In fact, I'm fond of saying to my not very well traveled friends in the United States who think that Sweden is socialist, I say, no, you're wrong. Sweden is capitalist. When the Saab Motor Company collapsed, did the government rush in and offer to help it? No way. They said, well, sorry, the market has spoken. You're out of luck. Whereas what happened in the great capitalist paradise of the United States when General Motors and Chrysler got into trouble? The government put up $25 billion. So I think it's possible to exaggerate the difference between Australia and the United States on one hand and Sweden and countries like that on the other. The big contrast is once all levels of government, I'm talking about say 1910, all levels of government in all civilized countries spent about 10% of national income. Now in Australia and the United States, they spend about a third of national income, all levels. And in France, which Henry Kissinger described as the only successful communist country, they spend 55%, the government does. Yet, France is not a catastrophe. It's kind of a French paradox, not the dietary French paradox, which is bad enough, but the socialist French paradox, that this government is very intrusive and has been very intrusive since, get this, the 16th century. They've been intruding, for hundreds of years. And yet, France is a creative society. Sweden is an economically creative society. So whatever it is that's in the water that makes people creative is what we need to, if that goes, if the government is so clumsy that it kills that, then we've got a problem.
Thanks. Cass?
Speaking of creativity, I wonder if you have any thoughts on why it is that it's so often now voices coming from the creative industries and the arts that are trying to stifle the sort of, the anti-market sentiment, anti-capitalist, the sort of support of people like Kanye West for the 1% campaign in the States. Why is it that the bohemian culture and artistic culture seems to be so set against the capitalism that creates the environment for it to flourish?
That is a deep puzzle. I have a chapter in my new book, which I'm urging you to order, on La Bohème, the opera. La Bohème, La Vie Bohème, which was written in the 1890s by Puccini on the basis of a play and novel of the late 1840s and early 1850s by a guy talking about the 1830s. And how many people here have seen the opera or heard the opera La Bohème? Put your hands up. There you go. A lot of you have. Have you ever, I said to my mom when I first saw it, she was an opera singer, and I said, boy, I like the music, but I didn't like the ethics of the opera. The ethics of the opera is that only bohemians, only artists, philosophers, poets are good people, and the bourgeoisie is there to be exploited for their benefit. You can steal from your uncle, who's a bourgeois man, perfectly ethically. How do I get along, says one of the characters. I get along, he sings it actually. And and my mom said, "Are you nuts? La Boheme's not about ethics. It's about the music." But that's an opera singer's view of it. But that's the puzzle. Why does the bourgeoisie, there you are, going to pay for an opera that attacks the bourgeoisie? We do it. We buy books, Gain, a book, a novel, American novel, or we go to see Wall Street 1, and then having not learned our lesson, we go to see Wall Street 2. And, you know, these artists are our children, by the way. And there's been this pattern since the middle of the 19th century of the artists and intellectuals, very often the sons and daughters of cotton merchants or factory owners, turning against their parents' lives and spreading this notion that there's something shameful about being in business. And the whole purpose of my 3 books and my passionate purpose in life is to try to convince my left-wing and some of my right-wing friends, some versions of right-wing friends, that this isn't so, that business is ethical. But, you know, so you ask a very deep historical question. What caused the rot? And as Milton Friedman once said, we tried socialism, it didn't work, and then people say, well, the solution is more socialism. I can't understand it.
Last one here.
Professor McCloskey, to what extent did bourgeois consumer institutions contribute to the global financial crisis and financial market innovation, and how damaged are the institutions and the engine as a result of that?
Well, you know, here's how capitalism works. And it works through innovation. And if you want a completely stable society that never has a business cycle, then you want to stop innovation. That'll be your first thing to do. Stop it, because innovation is creative destruction. It disturbs things. Since 1800, we've had 40 recessions, 40. When there's a mineral boom in Australia, it doesn't have it, but usually 40. And about a half dozen of them has been as bad as the last one. And the 1930s were much, much worse. The 1840s were much, much worse. So, we overdo things. That's what causes these ups and downs. We invent railways. Great idea. Let's do it. And then we make too many railways. We go nuts with railways. And we overinvest in railways. And then we say, oh God, we made a mistake. Maybe we shouldn't And then automobiles come along and we overinvest in those. And then we make financial innovations, such as the slicing and dicing of not very good mortgages. And you say, oh, that's terrible. Those rats. No, that was a financial innovation. That was a good thing done too much. But of course we're going to do that. We're humans. We get a new toy, we play with it. Oh boy, the boy with the hammer who thinks the whole world is a nail. And then we get depressed. I mean, the word is very expressive, depression. We get depressed, and the banks hold enormous amounts of money and don't loan it, and corporations have tremendous money balances and don't do anything with them, and because they're all terrified. And then they stop being terrified, and they go for the next fashion. But if you don't go for the next fashion, you're not innovating. You have to take a chance. This is true in your own life, and it's true in the life of the economy. So, yes, we're partly to blame. We consumers of these financial products are partly to blame. Partly the bankers are to blame, although I don't blame them too much. partly the regulators are to blame, lots of people are to blame, but in a dynamic economy, you're going to have ups and downs. We can't have an innovative economy without a cycle in business.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Deirdre. Before I call on Wolfgang Kasper to close the formal part of the proceeding tonight, I'd like to remind you that volumes 1 and 2
Volumes 1 and 2,
of the
and
book.
my autobiography, which tells about the 3 years of my gender change, which has a big section about Australia in it.
Right. Anyway, they'll be available just outside here, but now it's my pleasure to invite Professor Wolfgang Kasper to close tonight.
Thank you, Greg. It's an honor to say bravo, Deirdre McCloskey. You taught us a lot.
Thank you.
I have certain prejudices which are not very far away from yours. So what a pleasure it is to have listened to you, and what a pleasure it has been to have been reminded that we have to be praising heresy. La culture bohème. That is what enriches life and drives us forwards. Also, thank you for reminding us that the origins of economics are really in moral philosophy. Yeah. We've long forgot that neoclassical economics is all numbers and routines, but economics that is not connected to morality is anemic, pretty useless for policy advice as well. So I hope we have had some education on that one today. What does matter are the institutions, the rules of coordination, and the virtues in which these rules are based, what you call the bourgeois deal. It was not so important to look at the software of capitalism when we all tacitly shared this, when everyone had read the same Bible, but that's long ago. We now live in a globalized society. We have conflicts that we cannot understand without these cultural, moral differences. We also, in this immigration country, which is getting culturally more and more amorphous, have a lot of micro conflicts in the suburbs. I think more than some people who live in this hotel and realize. So the relevance of morality and the underlying need to have that bourgeois deal cannot be emphasized enough. We must realize that people of very different preferences can live peacefully together and cooperate in markets. When it gets politicized, you have conflict. And that is, I think, a very important lesson for Australia, where, like some European countries, we're moving that way. I also want to thank you for your unbounded optimism. I think it was a huge challenge to get that understanding of society and the world that was developed in the Netherlands to spread around further into Europe, up the River Rhine, into France, etc. And I think it's still, there we disagree probably a bit, still a very big challenge for the world as a whole. Capitalism for most countries, for most people where I work in Asia, is crony capitalism, something quite different from what we are talking about. It's a big challenge, as I totally agree, for that Marxist from Argentina, who is now the Pope. It's a huge challenge still in Brazil, in Egypt, in the Arab countries now. Africa, I won't even mention. So not only do read these books, which derive these important lessons from history, but if you know anyone in other cultures who believe that what governments have to do is to be business friendly, give them these books and tell them, by the way, they should be market friendly, pro-market, not pro-business. So this was very enlightening. Thank you. I probably haven't really done Deirdre a great deal of justice, offering a proper summary or thank you speech, but the lecture and the answers in the question and answer period were clear enough. And time, I think, is up. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much. Thank you on behalf of the CIS. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre.
The flu season is upon us. Which type will we worry about this year? And what kind of shots will we be told to take? Remember the swine flu scare of 1976? That was the year the U.S. government told us all that swine flu could turn out to be a killer that could spread across the nation. And Washington decided that every man, woman, and child in the nation should get a shot to prevent a nationwide outbreak, a pandemic. Well, 46 million of us obediently took the shot. And now 4,000 Americans are claiming damages from Uncle Sam amounting to $3.5 billion because of what happened when they took that shot. By far the greatest number of the claims, 2/3 of them, are for neurological damage or even death, allegedly triggered by the flu shot. We pick up the story back in 1976 when the threat posed by the swine flu virus seemed very real indeed.
This virus was the cause of a pandemic in 1918 and 1919 that resulted in over 500,000 deaths in the United States, as well as 20 million deaths around the world.
See how easy it is to...
Thus, the U.S. government's publicity machine was cranked into action to urge all America to protect itself against the swine flu menace.
Influenza is serious business. During major flu epidemics, millions of people are sick and thousands die. Well, this year you can get protection. The vaccines are safe, easy to take, and they can protect you against flu. So roll up your sleeve. Protect yourself.
One of those who did roll up her sleeve was Judy Roberts. She was perfectly healthy, an active woman, when in November of 1976, she took her shot. 2 weeks later, she says, she began to feel a numbness starting up her legs.
I joked about it at that time. I said I'll be numb to the knees by Friday if this keeps up. By the following week, I was totally paralyzed.
So completely paralyzed, in fact, that they had to operate on her to enable her to breathe. And for 6 months, Judy Roberts was a quadriplegic. The diagnosis? A neurological disorder called Guillain-Barré syndrome, GBS for short. These neurological diseases are little understood. They affect people in different ways. As you can see in these home movies taken by a friend, Judy Roberts' paralysis confined her mostly to a wheelchair for over a year. But this disease can even kill. Indeed, there are 300 claims now pending from the families of GBS victims who died, allegedly as a result of the swine flu shot. In other GBS victims, the crippling effects diminish and all but disappear. But for Judy Roberts, progress back to good health has been painful and partial.
Now, I noticed that your smile, Judy, is a little bit constricted.
Yes, it is.
Is it different from what it used to be?
Very different. I have a greatly decreased mobility in my lips. And I can't drink through a straw on the right-hand side. I can't blow out birthday candles. I don't whistle anymore, for which my husband is grateful.
It may be a little difficult for you to answer this question, but have you recovered as much as you are going to recover?
Yes, this is it.
So you will now have a legacy of braces on your legs for the rest of your life?
Yes, the weakness in my hands will stay and the leg braces will stay.
So Judy Roberts and her husband have filed a claim against the U.S. government. They're asking $12 million, though they don't expect to get nearly that much.
Judy, why did you take the flu shot?
I'd never taken any other flu shots, but I felt like this was going to be a major epidemic. And the only way to prevent a major epidemic of a really deadly variety of flu was for everybody to be immunized.
Where did this so-called deadly variety of flu, where did it first hit back in 1976? It began right here at Fort Dix in New Jersey in January of that year when a number of recruits began to complain of respiratory ailments, something like the common cold. An Army doctor here sent samples of their throat cultures to the New Jersey Public Health Lab to find out just what kind of bug was going around here. One of those samples was from a Private David Lewis who had left his sickbed to go on a forced march. Private Lewis had collapsed on that march, and his sergeant had revived him by mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. But the sergeant showed no signs of illness. A few days later, Private Lewis died.
If this disease is so potentially fatal that it's going to kill a young, healthy man, a middle-aged school teacher doesn't have a prayer.
The New Jersey lab identified most of those soldiers' throat cultures as the normal kind of flu virus going around that year, but they could not make out what kind of virus was in the culture from the dead soldier and from 4 others who were sick. So they sent those cultures to the Federal Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia for further study. A few days later, they got the verdict, swine flu. But that much publicized outbreak of swine flu at Fort Dix involved only Private Lewis, who died, and those 4 other soldiers who recovered completely without the swine flu shot.
If I had known at that time that the boy had been in a sick bed, got up, went out on a forced march, and then collapsed and died, I would never have taken the shot.
The rationale for our recommendation was not on the basis of the death of a single individual, but it was on the basis that when we do see a change in the characteristics of the influenza virus, it is a massive public health problem in this country.
Dr. David Senser, then head of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, is now in private industry. He devised the swine flu program, and he pushed it. You began to give flu shots to the American people in October of '76.
October 1st.
By that time, how many cases of swine flu around the world had been reported?
There had been several reported, but none confirmed. There had been cases in Australia that were reported by the press, by the news media. There were cases in...
None confirmed. Did you ever uncover any other outbreaks of swine flu anywhere in the world?
No.
Now, nearly everyone was to receive the shot in a public health facility where a doctor might not be present. Therefore, it was up to the CDC to come up with some kind of official consent form, giving the public all the information it needed about the swine flu shot. This form stated that the swine flu vaccine had been tested. What it didn't say was that after those tests were completed, the scientists developed another vaccine, and that was the one given to most of the 46 million who took the shot. That vaccine was called X53A.
Was X53A ever field tested?
I can't say. I would have to...
It wasn't.
I don't know.
Well, I would think that you're in charge of the program.
I would have to check the records. I haven't looked at this in some time.
The information form, the consent form, was also supposed to warn people about any risks of serious complications following the shot. But did it?
No, I had never heard of any reactions other than a sore arm, fever, this sort of thing.
Judy Roberts' husband, Gene, also took the shot.
Yes, I looked at that document. I signed it. Nothing on there said I was going to have a heart attack or I'd get Guillain-Barré, which I never heard of.
What if people from the government, from the Center for Disease Control, what if they had indeed known about it? What would be your feeling?
They should have told us.
Did anyone ever come to you and say, you know something, fellas? There's the possibility of neurological damage if you get into a mass immunization program?
No.
No one ever did?
No.
Do you know Michael Hatwick?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Michael Hatwick directed the surveillance team for the swine flu program at the CDC. His job was to find out what possible complications could arise from taking the shot and to report his findings to those in charge.
Did you know ahead of time, Dr. Hatwick, that there had been case reports of neurological disorders, neurological illness, apparently associated with the injection of influenza vaccine?
Absolutely.
You did?
Yes.
How'd you know that?
By review of the literature
So you told your superiors, the men in charge of the swine flu immunization program, about the possibility of neurological disorders?
Absolutely.
What would you say if I told you that your superiors say that you never told them about the possibility of neurological complications?
That's nonsense. I can't believe that they would say that they did not know that there were neurological illnesses associated with influenza vaccination. That simply is not true. We did know that.
I've said that Dr. Hatwick had never told me of his feelings on this subject.
Then he's lying.
I guess you would have to make that assumption.
Then why does this report from your own agency, dated July 1976, list neurological complications as a possibility?
I think the consensus of the scientific community was that the evidence relating neurologic disorders to influenza immunization was such that they did not feel that this association was a real one.
You didn't feel it was necessary to tell American people that information?
I think that over the years we have tried to inform the American people as fully as possible.
As part of informing Americans about the swine flu threat, Dr. Sensor's CDC also helped create the advertising to get the public to take the shot.
Let me read to you from one of your own agency's memos planning the campaign to urge Americans to take the shot. The swine flu vaccine has been taken by many important persons, he wrote. Example, President Ford, Henry Kissinger, Elton John, Muhammad Ali, Mary Tyler Moore, Rudolph Nureyev, Walter Cronkite, Ralph Nader, Edward Kennedy, etc., etc. True?
I'm not familiar with that particular piece of paper, but I do know that at least of that group, President Ford did take the vaccination.
Did you talk to these people beforehand to find out if they planned to take the shot?
I did not know.
Did anybody?
I do not know.
Did you get permission to use their names in your campaign?
I do not know.
Mary, did you take a swine flu shot?
No, I did not.
Did you give them permission to use your name saying that you had or were going to?
Absolutely not. Never did.
Did you ask your own doctor about taking the swine flu shot?
Yes, and at the time he thought it might be a good idea. But I resisted it because I was leery of having the symptoms that sometimes go with that kind of inoculation.
So you didn't?
No, I didn't.
Have you spoken to your doctor since?
Yes.
And?
He's delighted that I didn't take that shot.
You're in charge. Somebody's in charge.
There are...
This is your advertising strategy that I have a copy of here.
Who's it signed by?
This one is unsigned. But you'll acknowledge that it was your baby, so to speak.
It could have been from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. It could be from CDC. I don't know. I'll be happy to take responsibility for it.
It's been 3 years now since you fell ill with GBS, right?
Right.
Has the federal government, in your estimation, played fair with you about your claim?
No, I don't think so. It seems to be dragging on and on and on, and really no end in sight that I can see at this point.
With respect to the cases of Guillain-Barré, allegedly...
Former Secretary of HEW Joseph Califano, too, was disturbed that there was no end in sight. So a year and a half ago, he promised that Uncle Sam would cut the bureaucratic red tape for victims suffering from GBS and would pay up quickly.
We shouldn't hold them to an impossible or too difficult standard of proving that they were hurt. Even if we pay a few people a few $1,000s that might not have deserved it, I think justice requires that we promptly pay those people who do deserve it.
Who's making the decision to be so hard-nosed about settling?
Well, I assume the Justice Department is.
Griffin Bell before he left?
Well, the Justice Department agreed to the statement I made. It was cleared word for word with the lawyers in the Justice Department by my HEW lawyers.
And that statement said, in effect?
That statement said that we should pay Guillain-Barré claims without regard to whether the federal government was negligent if they resulted from the swine flu shot.
I think the government knows it's wrong.
If it drags out long enough, that people will just give up. Let it go.
I am a little more adamant in my thoughts than my wife is, because I told Judy to take the shot. She wasn't going to take it, and she never had shots. And I'm mad with my government because they knew the facts. But they didn't release those facts because if they had released them, the people wouldn't have taken. And they can come out tomorrow and tell me there's going to be an epidemic and they can drop off like flies next to me. I will not take another shot that my government tells me to take.
Meantime, Judy Roberts and some 4,000 others like her are still waiting for their day in court.
I don't need another flu shot. I had a flu shot last year. A swine flu epidemic may be coming.
Swine flu shot? Well, I don't know. I've been thinking about it.
It could make you very sick.
Swine flu? Man, I'm too fast today to catch me.
You'll want to be protected.
I'm the healthiest 55-year-old you ever seen. Hey, I play golf every weekend.
Get a shot of protection. The swine flu shot.
Joe brought it home from the office. He gave it to Betty and one of his kids and to Betty's mother. But Betty's mother went back to California the next day. On her way to the airport, she gave it to a cab driver, a ticket agent, and one of the charming stewardesses. At school, Joe's kid gave it to some other kids, and Mrs. Merrill got it and gave it to her husband. In California, Betty's mother gave it to her best friend, Dottie. But Dottie had a heart condition and she died. But before she died, Dottie gave it to her girlfriend, the mailman, the paper boy, and the vet when she went to pick up her chihuahua.
If a swine flu epidemic comes, this is how it could spread. You'll want to be protected, especially if you're elderly or chronically ill. Get a shot of protection, the swine flu shot.